Hey friends, let's talk today about research ethics. Let's start with the fact that ethics are very subjective. So we're going to talk a lot about a gray area. There's not a whole lot of black and white when it comes to research ethics, excuse me. But I'm going to give you some examples that I think really concretely define what ethics looks like, where ethics falls and doesn't. And we'll start actually with the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I'm sure you're familiar with at this point in your career. Of course, there's a picture of it on the left with the inmates there with the bags on their heads, part of the psychological and physical abuse that they experienced at the hands of the other participants. And there's the man himself on the right side, Philip Zimbardo, Dr. Philip Zimbardo. I had the privilege of meeting him. That's me on the left. Had the privilege of meeting him a few years ago when I presented at Stanford. Incredible human being, very, very interesting research, which I would argue is actually entirely ethical. So let's look at how we approach these things. So first and foremost, and the slide actually says slightly otherwise, but the most important duty of a behavioral scientist is to protect the rights of participants. I know it's listed as number two. I should change it. I don't know why I don't change it. It should be number one. First and foremost, we need to protect the rights of participants, very much like the Hippocratic Oath that you might take as a medical professional. First part of it is do no harm, right? And you might think, aha, yes, but doctors do hurt you. They have to hurt you sometimes to heal you. That's the nature of ethics, right? That's exactly what we're talking about is yes, they do hurt you, but it's for the greater purpose of trying to heal you. So we'll get into that a little bit further. As I've already said, ethics are very subjective, very interpretable. There's a lot of different approaches to ethics, and if you've taken a philosophy class, you know this. But the three we're going to talk about today are deontological, ethical skepticism, and utilitarian. Deontological is essentially that there is always going to be right and wrong, right? If I said, okay, well, we have to kill 10,000 rats to try and find a cure for COVID, you might say, well, a cure for COVID would be good, but killing anything is not a good idea, right? It actually fits very well with like a Judeo-Christian perspective. It's not a Christian perspective, but it fits well within what the Christian perspective might look like. Ethical skepticism, by contrast, is a complete opposite. There are no moral codes. Anything goes, basically, right? And I'm going to parallel this in a second to the Nazi research that took place during the Holocaust. And I really want to emphasize this too, because this one does not require any justification. It's not anything goes because da 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 da, or anything can be done if it's done in this context. It's just anything goes, right? Utilitarian, by contrast, is based on the means being justified by the ends, right? So if I told you we could cure COVID now and forever, not a single other person has to die from COVID, if I was able to do an experiment where I killed 10,000 rats, right? Many people would say just kill the rats, right? 10,000 rat lives versus the 5 million deaths worldwide that have already been incurred due to COVID. I think it's a no-brainer, but it's utilitarian. We're judging how the outcome might offset the means to get there. So some bad research, and I might put this in quotes, bad research, because it's as I said, very interpretable, very subjective. The Stanford Prison Study, as you know, during that study, it was actually supposed to be 2 weeks long, but people started freaking out. Participants started reporting suicidal thoughts and ideation, clinical levels of depression, and so a lot of physical negative symptoms as well. So they actually pulled the plug after 6 days of the study. That is the reason why I would consider this study ethical, because they stopped, right? Bad research, I don't think it's bad research. In fact, I think it's excellent research because we need to know what incarceration does to people's psychological well-being. However, I think it's ethical only because they stopped. If they'd gone the full 2 weeks, it would have been an unethical study. A lot of people disagree with me. I feel that I'm right, but they have a good entitlement to their opinion because it's a very gray study. The Tuskegee experiments, if you don't know about this, I'd invite you to look it up. This was a series of experiments that the U.S. government, the Air Force did on men in the Air Force, where they deliberately injected them with syphilis to see the effects of syphilis on the human body. What's very important about the study is, aside from being an unethical treatment, they were not allowed to refuse the shot, right? It was only conducted on black Air Force members, right? So not only is there a very unethical aspect with regard to the treatment, but also a very unethical aspect to the fact that it was essentially racist in its perspective, right? They only experimented on these black platoons. I don't know what you even call them in the Air Force, but units, right? Completely unethical, very bad. No defending that. Nazi experimentation, I'm not going to go into detail on this because it's just brutal. I'm sure you might know some of it. If you need to, you can Wikipedia it. There's a doctor whose name was Joseph Mengele, who was just horrible. He oversaw a lot of this experimentation. I would consider both the Tuskegee experiments and Nazi experimentation to be the epitome of ethical skepticism. And I include both of them on there because it's easy to say, okay, well, in Nazi Germany, anything went. We can just, just say how horrible it was then. Yeah, but the Tuskegee experiments took place in our country on our servicemen in the 20th century. I mean, like, that's inexcusable as well, and they follow the same perspective. So I want to put them on the same slide there. The Milgram Obedience Studies, this is a study that was actually developed by someone who was a World War II immigrant, refugee rather, and he wanted to see why people would actually follow the orders to kill these innocent Jewish families, right? And so he set up a study that was making people think that they were hurting someone else, to see if they would actually continue to do so just because they were told to do so. And what he found, even though he hypothesized that only 1 out of 1,000 people would do the full harm all the way to the end of the scale, he actually found that 66% of people went the full length. So a very ethical study, but it's something that people get upset about. They talk about it being unethical because of the psychological stress. The autism and vaccination research, there was a study that came out years ago, I want to say probably 15 now, that said that the mercury content used as a preservative in vaccines caused autism, right? In this case, what makes this study unethical is the fact that they unethically reported it. Their data did not actually support these findings, and I'm not trying to push an agenda. You're welcome to look it up. But even the people that wrote the study acknowledged that they falsified the data and they misreported the findings, right? There has not been research to further confirm this conclusion. And the reason why I put this one on here is because not because the topic is unethical. Excellent topic. We need to continue to explore autism research, but and vaccination research, but we really cannot have studies deliberately misreporting. That's where the unethical aspect comes in. Ethically conducted, ethically designed, ethical field of study, unethically reported. That's what led to it being bad research. Okay. So some guidelines overall. Essentially, what you're doing is a cost-benefit analysis. If you've ever taken an economics class, you're familiar with this term, cost-benefit analysis. And what you're doing is seeing, okay, is the research justifiable with regard to conduct as far as the outcome goes, right? So if you're going to hurt people, if you're going to make them psychologically uncomfortable, is it worth doing based on what you expect to get out of it, right? Potential benefits. The textbook uses actually all of these. The one that I would really emphasize is number 3 on this list. If I was to ask you, that is the most important one, practical outcomes. How does the research make life better? How does it improve the world? How does it maybe extend people's lives or make people suffer less or what have you? Does it have a practical outcome? That is the number 1 benefit. The one I include on here, just because textbooks tend to, I want you to cross it right out if you're taking notes, are the benefits to the researchers. That should not be a concern. That should not be a concern. Because the idea of research is you're not trying to do things better for yourself, you're trying to do things better for society. It should be a very almost philanthropic sort of endeavor, right? So you're trying to make things better for everybody. It's not about your personal gain. A good example of this would be Jonas Salk, the gentleman who invented the polio vaccine. I'd invite you to read about him. He's the epitome of selfless scientist. So some guidelines we want to talk about. What are the potential costs? And these costs, by the way, are the ones that are incurred by the participants. These are not costs to the researcher, right? So obviously time and effort, it is what it is. Stress and boredom, I don't really care about that one, to be honest with you. As a professor, I get paid to stress students out and bore students, so it's whatever. Social discomfort is very important. Mental discomfort is also very important, but the most important, hear me well, the most important is physical discomfort. You are not supposed to hurt people unless you have a darn good reason to do so, right? So if you're going to try and get this past a review committee, right, an IRB, you have to document why, if you do cause them physical discomfort, why it was so important, why it was so essential. Social and psychological and mental discomfort come a close second, but it's usually more justifiable just because a lot of good research is going to make people psychologically uncomfortable. And as the slide indicates, the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, sometimes referred to as an ethical review board, they actually will say, okay, the costs are this, the benefits are that. Is it worth it? Right? They get to decide whether or not it's worth it. Every research institution should have an IRB. HBU, of course, has an IRB. I actually am on the IRB at HBU. But it's their responsibility to make sure that the research being conducted at the university is ethical and meets with the guidelines that they feel are justifiable. But in this case, the IRB is also guided by Judeo-Christian guidelines because of it being a Christian school. So you see the idea, you see where a lot of the subjectivity might come in. Informed consent. This is massive. Make sure you know the term specifically, informed consent. And that is essential. The participants must know what they are going to experience before they experience it. right? They must be informed of what they're going to experience before they experience it. And all of these points are important. I would make sure you know these. But what I want to point out is number 4 on that list, the right to refuse to participate or withdraw from any time, right? Participants do not have to participate in your study. It should always be voluntary, right? The consent has to be given explicitly. But the other side of this too is if they are participating in your study, let's say they're 20 minutes into a 30-minute study, and they decide, you know what, I don't like this, it's making me uncomfortable, they are allowed to withdraw at that point too. Their consent doesn't bind them forever. It's an ongoing agreement. A week later, if they've done your study and a week later they call you up and say, hey, by the way, I'm in your study, I'm participant number 67, but I don't like it, it hasn't sat well, I don't care for it, please take my data out. As a researcher, you are obligated to remove their data, right? Their consent must be continuous. It can be withdrawn at any single time, both during and after the study, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. Privacy, this is a big one, right? So people are very concerned about their privacy, but at the same time, we're very public sort of people. If you have a social media account, you might be posting pictures and events and names of your family and what you're doing and everything like this. But at the same time, we also want to make sure we're mindful of participants' privacy, right? So when we talk about public observation, if I was to go to the Galleria is that way. If I was to go to the Galleria and observe people in the food court as they ate, right? I can do that without asking them to participate because it's a public venue, right? It's what's called tacit consent. You don't need to write that down necessarily, but tacit consent. They exist in a public place. I exist in a public place, so I can observe them without asking them to participate in my study. However, the big thing you want to remember is if they are uncomfortable by what I'm doing, by my observations, and come over and ask me to not use their data, I am not allowed to use their data. So I can use their data without permission, but once they explicitly remove the permission, I can no longer use their data, right? And that's the gray area that you have to deal with when you talk about privacy. It's a real slippery slope. It's an ongoing discussion, right? And when you think of internet privacy, that's a whole other kettle of fish. Technically, if you have a public account on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, I can go on as a researcher and harvest your data, and I don't have to ask you anything. Don't have to ask you about it, all right? However, if you know that I've done it and you don't want me to, and you tell me you don't want me to, now I can't. Right? It's a real gray area, man. You have to be very cautious. Coercion. Coercion is something that we don't think about a lot. Coercion is not bribery. Let's make this very clear. Bribes are not ethical. Coercion is, right? And you might think, what's the difference? They're the same thing. Ah ha ha. Bribes are larger. Coercion or inducements are smaller, right? So if I wanted my students to participate in my research, if the whole course is worth 1,000 points, I could give them 5 points to participate in my research. That's an inducement. That's coercion, right? Those 5 little points out of 1,000 aren't going to matter much at all, right? But if I said, I'll give you 200 points if you participate in my research, we're talking about 1/5 of their letter grade. So they'd be a fool not to. That's a bribe, right? And of course, there's a lot of gray in between. When does a coercion or inducement become a bribe? It's gray. You got to be very cautious. I always try and make my inducements as small as possible, so there's not a question of whether or not they are bribes, okay? Minimal risk. We want to make sure we understand minimal risk. Minimal risk is essentially the amount of stress that you can put a participant through in your research, right? And if you look at the definition, it tries to be very, linear, but in fact it's not. The risk to research participants is no greater than they would be likely to encounter in daily life or during routine physical or psychological examinations. That is a wide, wide door to walk through, right? Nothing but subjectivity right there. What you want to do is you want to make sure that whatever risk they're exposed to, you can justify. Do not put them at a risk that is beyond what you can justify. And I know that doesn't clarify things much either, but just that's the mindset that you need to have when you're considering this. Once again, splitting hairs. We cannot deceive participants. Oh, excuse me. We can deceive participants, but we cannot lie to them, right? They are different terms. Deception is omitting certain pieces of information. Lying is denying things explicitly that are true. Right? So an experimental confederate could be a situation like in the Solomon-Asch studies where a participant or where a researcher is posing as a participant. In that case, you're not lying to the other participants. You're not saying, oh, that guy's a participant. You're just having them present as a participant. If they ask you, is that person an experimental confederate or a participant, and you lie, that's unethical. All right? So you see what we're talking about here is you might think lying and deception mean the same thing. They don't, but there's a thin, thin gray line that separates the two of them. And that is the nature of the complexity of ethics and research.